In my book, I have explored 75 crises. I have gone through the crisis
Right.
and the leadership insights behind that.
Scientific and technological knowledge is very important. We have independent judiciary and court systems. These institutions can ultimately, determine the future irrespective of the fact that the leaders are good or the leaders are bad.
Hi Neha, welcome to Spark Igniting Minds.
Hi,
It's
ma'am.
really a very happy situation that you have come here. And today let's discuss something around my book, Whispers of the Soil. Maybe topics like how geography decides destiny. So, when I wrote my book, Whispers of the Soil, I believed that geography is the one which decides the destiny of the nation. But as I researched, and I also thought that countries which have oil, fertile land, or any other resources, they would naturally prosper. But when I researched my book, and almost I went through many crisis situations, like even when you take Japan for that matter, Singapore, which is a very small country, though they don't have any natural resources, but they have prospered better than any other nation which are full of resources. That made me think it is not geography or the resources which really determine the
Determine.
destiny of the nation.
Yes.
It is the leadership.
Leadership.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's why. So it is always not the geography and resources may be inert, but the leaders who make good choices, that helps the countries whether to prosper or to fail.
Fail. Yes. Exactly, ma'am. You're right in that sense.
Yeah.
So, basically, as far as you were mentioning about geography, so I have two arguments to put in. As far as geography is concerned, yes, geography does shape destiny, because if you have fertile lands, if you have strategic waterways, if you have all the resources at your place, then yes, it can contribute to the wealth of the nation. It can fund infrastructure projects, it can fund public welfare and education. That is one, point supporting that geography contributes to the destiny of a nation. But to put it otherwise, the counter argument would say that geography is actually just like resources inert. It's just a physical map, it's just a terrain. What important, as you just said, rightly said, is how resources are picked up by the leaders, number one. And number second, what are the policy choices and what are the legal frameworks that are present which would actually institutionalize these particular resources? Because ultimately what is important is the institutional capacity, the leadership, and not just resources.
I would like to ask you a question, Neha. If geography alone does not determine the destiny of the nation, what is the role of the international law? Now, does it help countries cooperate despite geographical limitations?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, as far as international law is concerned, international law is all about cooperation, global cooperation. Now, when we talk about international law is a soft law, although it does not have a very strong enforcement mechanism, but ultimately in law there is a concept called as positive morality.
Okay.
Now, according to positive morality, now states will adhere to international law, although there are no sanctions for not adhering to it. There are no stringent sanctions. But when we talk about shared resources, when we talk about shared prosperity, what is important for the nations to remember is that international law is always there. But what is important is the outcome of it. And the outcome will ultimately be decided by leaders. The outcome will be ultimately be decided by the institutional mechanisms. So to say that yes, international law is in operation, but international law would not help you in such a way wherein it will try to influence your domestic politics. Domestic politics is quite independent than international law. Although they are interdependent, some kind of intermingling does happen, but to say that, the role of global cooperation, the role of, the states cooperating with each other, that is one of the essence of international law, and that is where nations tend to feel that, all right, they have a sense of shared prosperity.
No, but what happens if, does the political system dominate over the laws and the policies that has been laid out by the international law?
Right, ma'am.
Can they
Now,
even, violate those laws?
yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Now, if we take a very recent example of the US-Iran-Israel war, we often see that we have the United Nations in place, we have the international frameworks in place, yet we see that there is a blatant violation of international law.
Yes.
Although we do have sanctions, but it's always said in international law that might is right. And USA being powerful, it is using all the tactics of Sam Dand Bhed to utilize all the resources of the other countries and to basically dominate the world. So yes, there are chances that domestic politics is influencing international law, and international law is also influencing domestic politics. It is a two-way process basically. So now the nations are coming together not just because of shared political values, but because of strategic corridors. They are coming together because of alliances. They're coming together because of supply chains, and not just because of shared political values.
That concludes that perhaps geography gives us the stage, but it is always the leaders who write the story.
Right.
Even when there is an international law, a stringent law, they may not follow sometimes. It is
Right.
always the leadership
Right.
choices
Right.
that plays or
Right.
that determines the destiny.
Yes,
of the
so the outcome basically, in conclusion, it is to say that the outcome is usually decided by the leadership choice, the policy choices they make, and how strengthened the institutional mechanism is.
Okay.
Yes.
So let us move to the next point. Like, are resources a blessing or a curse? When natural resources should make nations prosperous, like history often has a different role to play.
Yes.
It has a different story.
Yes, yes.
So in my book, I have explored 75 crises. I have gone through the crisis
Right.
and the leadership insights behind that.
Right.
It is not, after every crisis, what I learned was, it is not anything that matters, but the leadership
Right.
choices that they make,
Right.
that matters most
Right.
in either solving or negotiating or navigating or even failing.
Right.
It is always leadership's, whatever you said,
Right.
the policies that they make,
Right.
or the choices that they make,
Right.
or the decisions that they take.
Right.
These are the things that will determine. So today, like countries are competing for so many things.
Right.
It may be not only oil and water.
Right.
It may be the critical minerals or AI,
Rare earth.
rare earth materials.
Yes.
And so many things are playing these days. The leadership has to be something very, very different
Right.
of what it was in
Right.
the past.
Yes.
But I haven't given in my book any template for the
Right.
leaders to follow.
Right.
But they can always emulate leaders like Eisenhower,
Right.
even Manmohan Singh or
Right.
Indira Gandhi, or even Faisal, who was giving warnings and
Right.
telling them how
Right.
there may be a oil shock if you don't listen to me.
Right.
So these were some of the emulations that leaders can follow today.
Right.
So if I have to tell you a story, let me take to the Indonesia where nickel is in abundance.
Correct.
So nickel, usually we are using it in the microchips, and also, so that may be a trending leadership story tomorrow.
Yes.
Because now we are fighting for the oil.
Right.
Now oil is leading the
Global scenario.
global
Yeah.
strategies or
Yes.
global political leadership.
Yes.
But tomorrow it may be these chips.
Right.
Which, so
In fact, ma'am, that is
Indonesia has taken a very strategic decision
Yes,
in this
right.
matter.
Right.
It says that it will not export nickel, but instead it is asking the other countries to come and process nickel in their own country.
Right,
So these are the very important
Right.
decisions that the
Right.
leaders should take for a country to prosper.
I think one of the examples you beautifully mentioned about nickel, I can just elaborate on that being an international law expert. That when we talk about semiconductors currently and the supply chain resilience that we are talking about, now Taiwan, the picture of Taiwan, now Taiwan is doing very well as far as manufacturing, processing of semiconductor chips is concerned.
Okay.
Now we see that how a particular resource is influencing the foreign policy decisions of USA. Now, USA blatantly does not recognize Taiwan, but yes, we have heard of stories of weapons being supplied to Taiwan, and then the US ships navigating the waters around the Formosa Strait, right? So, the foreign policy choices are influenced heavily by the capacities of other nations. Just because Taiwan is capable and USA recognizes that particular, advantage of Taiwan, it wants to capitalize on its particular, interest. It wants to capitalize on that particular advantage, and that is why we see that there are skirmishes which usually happen.
Again, here also, China is against Taiwan, and it doesn't want US to interfere with the
Right.
with anything about
Right.
Taiwan and China relations.
Right.
That's again happening.
Right.
So I feel that resources themselves is not a blessing or a curse.
Right.
It is like how leadership decides
Right.
whether they become a source of prosperity or a source of conflict.
Right.
Isn't it?
Yes.
So, can international law ensure that shared resources are managed fairly, or does political power usually dominate?
Ma'am, I would say I would adopt a balanced view in this. So, as far as shared resources are concerned, yes, international law plays a role. Let me give you an example. We have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea 1982.
Yeah.
Now, this UN clause is specifically laying out the territorial baselines, and it is talking about how resources have to be shared. It talks about exclusive economic zone. It talks about contiguous zone. It talks about continental shelf. It talks about high seas. All these are the concepts which are under the law of the sea. Now, we have international law, but we of course see that there is blatant violation of it by superpowers. To give you an example, when we talk about law of the sea, you will see that a lot of times there is an infringement of the exclusive economic zone of the other nations, right? So I think that international law is in place, but because of a lack of a strategized, enforcement capacity of the international law, what is usually happening is that the political power is usually dominating. And as I previously said about might is right, those countries which have the supply chain resilience, those countries which have the military might and the political might, and of course they enjoy the popular will and the popular support of the people, they are able to take crucial policy decisions. So, conclusion may I would just say that yes, to talk about in theory, we would say that international law is doing wonders and international law is keeping everyone in their limits. But to talk about practicality in international and world affairs, it's ultimately the dictum of the political power which is running the world.
When there is a law, when
Right.
there is something to control the nations,
Right.
if the political dictum or political power,
Right.
if they don't listen to the law,
Right.
then I think the countries fail.
Correct. Ma'am, I think international law is also
Because
very,
always international law thinks and it does justice to both the nations.
right.
Yeah,
Right.
because here selfish plays critical role.
Correct.
And
Ma'am,
they
if you
take the
see, if you see the institutions of international law like the UN, the WTO, if you see the permanent five of the Security Council, who is dominating them? It is the US ultimately. So US is ultimately shaping the policy decisions and determining the future of the other countries.
Yes.
So it's like there is a conflict of interest wherein USA is accused of violation of human rights. US is accused of, in fact, stealing away the resources of other countries. But when it is time to take action, US is sitting in the membership of the council.
Yeah.
So that is where the concept of veto comes in, right? And that is how sadly to say so, that political power is actually dictating the affairs of the world and how the world will move forward.
Okay, so when coming to the next topic, can institutions survive bad leaders?
All right.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
we always discuss whether it is leadership strategies
Right.
or the institutions which drive the politics, geopolitics of the world,
Right.
isn't it?
Right.
So, one question that stayed with me throughout my research: can institutions remain strong even when political leadership
All
fails?
right. Yes, ma'am. So, to answer this question, I have a multi pronged approach. The first approach to say so is that yes, institutions can survive bad leaders. Number one, because when we have a professional bureaucracy, when we have strong media, we have independent judiciary and court systems, these institutions can ultimately, determine the future irrespective of the fact that the leaders are good or the leaders are bad.
Yeah.
Because ultimately what matters is the strength of the institution. So that is one point which I wanted to make. Now the second point, which is counter to the first point, is now there can be cases wherein political power and your personalized leadership choices, they are affecting these independent institutions. There is a system called as checks and balances. Now because of the leaders' personal opinions or their ideologies, there are huge chances that this check and balance system will be altered. And then ultimately, even if institutions are robust, the quality of the institutions is diluted by bad leaders. Right? So this is how we need to understand it using a multi-pronged approach, wherein we do not just take one side, but it basically depends upon a lot on the institutional capacity. Of course, in conclusion, I would say that yes, institutions can survive bad leaders, but at the same time, it is very important that the system of checks and balances is maintained.
What I have explored in my book
Right.
is that institutions,
Right.
like even from the World Bank,
Right.
you can see Eugene Black,
Yes.
who really finalized the treaty between
Indus
the India
waters.
and Pakistan,
Yes.
though they were rival countries.
Right.
And this treaty survived decades, I can say, almost 64 years.
Right.
So, what I mean to say is maybe there may be bad leaders or good leaders.
Right.
So, the institutions once, I mean, if it is in a very designed in such a way that it cannot be disturbed or it favors both the countries.
Correct.
If it is designed in that way, it will carry the countries in peace for a very long time.
Right, ma'am. You are right in arguing the point that, World Bank mediated and acted as a mediator in settlement of the Indus Water Treaty. Now, we have seen that it was doing very well, wherein clear demarcation of the western rivers was given to Pakistan and the three eastern rivers was given to India. That was a very well chalked out treaty and it adopted a very unified approach.
Correct.
The dispute resolution mechanism was also clearly settled. It said that, if there is a dispute, first you appoint a person and then you go to the permanent court of arbitration, right? So all these kinds of mechanisms were laid down, wherein lot was not left to the discretion of the future leaders. So that is one such remarkable point of this treaty, wherein taking away the huge discretionary power from the leaders actually was one of the reasons that this treaty could survive all these years. Yes.
So the treaty, which was designed in 1960,
Right.
though it stood the test of time,
Right.
but maybe we don't know why people are drifting away from that. Maybe the climate change is one of the reason.
Right.
And even when we take an example of the Atlantic Treaty that was
Right.
made,
Right.
now I mean even Russia and America, though they had a Cold War, the Atlantic Treaty again was made and both abided by it.
Correct.
But again there is a greed of getting those critical minerals and all of those. I mean, this treaty also may break.
Right.
Though it had survived for very long term.
Ma'am, ultimately,
Yeah.
in international law, we usually say that there are no permanent friends and enemies, but only national interest.
Yeah.
Right. So nations are, taking the decisions according to the national interest. Leaders are being swayed away by your electoral gimmicks, and that is how I think international law is also being diluted to an extent by the powers who claim to be the safeguards of international law. They claim that they are the watchdogs of international law, but ultimately, if you see in the practical reality, they are the blatant violators of international law.
Okay, and I think what we can conclude from this discussion is whatever may be the case, it may deviate after a very long term,
Right.
but strong institutions are the one that provide continuity.
Right.
Isn't
Yes,
it?
ma'am. Yes.
So even when politics becomes uncertain, it
Right.
is the institutional leadership
Right.
that really makes a difference in keeping the world peace.
Yes, ma'am, you're right, because ultimately it's all about institutional readiness, its mechanism, and its capacity. Leaders come and go, but the institutions will stay. And who is ultimately making the institutions? We, the people of India. When it says in the preamble of the Constitution, it's us, it's we, wherein our popular will is being reflected in the parliament. Right? So if the institutions are strong, the economic institutions, political institutions, the media institutions are strong, we can very well say that yes, institutions can be there, and your country or the world can survive bad leaders, right? Because ultimately what matters is in international law how capable and to what level you have your strategic autonomy in place. So here when I mention about strategic autonomy, there is a concept called as dehyphenation, wherein we say that the countries have to decide for themselves. Wherein you rightly mentioned about Japan and Indonesia and even Vietnam, what they do is that they have the resources, but they are calibrating their approach in such a manner wherein they are attracting foreign investments, but they are not compromising on their autonomy. But if you see the example of the Belt and Road Initiative of China, when it started investing in the Hambantota port and took it on lease for 99 years, you see that this was the case wherein Sri Lanka, just for foreign borrowing and to service the foreign debt, right, or the sovereign debt, it actually gave up its autonomy and sovereignty. So we have two conflicting examples wherein one part of the nation is trying to focus on its sovereignty, where the other part is trying to gather resources, gather wealth, but at the cost of what? At the cost of their right to self-determination.
That was well said, Neha. Yes. What I feel is, as you said, there are two different examples, like leaders who can protect their sovereignty by taking strategic decisions, or leaders who can give away their sovereignty or give away just getting into the debt, like what you mentioned about the Hambantota port.
Yes.
That's a very good example how nations getting into debts and getting influenced by other countries can lose their nation itself.
Right. Yes, ma'am.